Hi, my name is Matthew Bellisario. I'm your host here on the BellisarioSonic YouTube channel, broadcasting from the heart of the Deep South on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama. I'm introducing to you tonight the first of a new series of podcasts. These will be made for YouTube, but they will be only audio. And I'm kind of basing this series off of late night radio. And so that's going to hopefully be the feel of this. And the name of this series is called Jazz Themes. In each episode, we're going to talk about a specific theme concerning the great jazz genre. Tonight, I'm going to take a look at some early pioneers of jazz. Now, these episodes, sometimes they'll just be me talking. Other times I may have a guest on. Of course, I want you to leave your comments. For your participation is definitely appreciated, and those who listen to this series in the future, I'm sure will gain much from the comments that you leave. Again, these episodes will follow kind of the format of a late night radio program, and that's when I'm recording these. Late night radio has always been something that I've been very fond of, and when I worked in Florida for a cell phone company, I would often work late nights, and I would drive around and visit cell sites in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere many times, and coast to coast radio would keep me company. So it's my hope that this might do the same for you, while you're driving, whether you fall asleep to it, it takes you 2 or 3 nights to listen to it all. I just hope that it's something that you might find interesting. I not only want to share great music on this YouTube channel, but I also want to keep the jazz tradition alive by looking at its history. You may ask, well, why take the time to research this topic and present these themes surrounding jazz music? After all, the episode that you're listening to now took many hours to put together. I had to research it, think about what I wanted to say, and write it all up. Why put all this work in? We'll only get about 50 views or listens. Who knows? If you get something out of it, please leave your comments and share it with other people. Jazz music is a passion for me, if you don't know that already. And I think that by doing these, not only will you be entertained and educated, but I will as well, because of all the research that goes into this, reading, pulling from books and different sources, from the different people I've talked to on this channel, to the people here in Birmingham, these great jazz musicians that I talk to at the jam session every Tuesday night here in Birmingham. A lot of wisdom from these musicians, especially the 2 Hall of Fame trumpet players here in Birmingham, Jose Carr and Bo Berry. The wonderful thing about jazz is that these themes that we're going to explore together are virtually endless. The jazz tradition is certainly rich in history, legend, and lore. We are privileged to have access to many decades of wonderful jazz recordings that enrich our lives. And it's interesting because the history of recorded music is a relatively brief one when you look at the history of man, beginning only in 1877 with Edison's phonograph cylinder. As far as jazz music goes, we're in a very good place when it comes to documented recordings. We have an extensive historical record of recorded music we can refer to, and we can even go back to the very origins of jazz and its continued development we can follow with all these recordings. From its beginning, spawning off from ragtime artists such as the pianist and composer Scott Joplin, to pioneers of improvisation such as Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet, to its great innovators such as John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman, Jazz has now well over 100 years of spectacular recordings. The catalog for us is virtually endless now, and a person even well versed in jazz music would be a fool to say that they're familiar with it all, because really we can only skim the deep waters of this vast lineage of recordings. So beware for those who say they're experts on jazz. For are there any real experts except maybe those who continue to carry it on as musicians, and even they are only exposed to a certain amount of recordings. And that's the wonderful thing about music, isn't it? We can continue to dive into it for our entire lives. Along the way, we're going to stop and we're going to take audio tours all around the United States. We're going to talk about the great cities of jazz, such as New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City, New York, Los Angeles, and others where jazz flourished, it thrived, developed, and sometimes even almost died. We're going to visit the smoky, dark clubs as those that line 52nd Street in New York or Central Avenue in Los Angeles. The musicians, though. Oh, the caliber of musicians we're going to talk about. Characters, personalities, innovators. Some formally schooled, others only schooled by the streets. They'll come along with us for the ride. Whether it's the short life of the geniuses such as Charlie Parker, Clifford Brown, or Eric Dolphy, or the long legacies of Duke Ellington, Ray Brown, or Ron Carter, they all have a story to tell and jazz wisdom to share with us. I will also take insights from the many jazz artists, again, that I've spoken to in person, as those that I've interviewed on this channel. On occasion, I'll even introduce you to a new guest on this program. So there's going to be a lot for you to absorb over the course of each episode. And I hope that these episodes can accompany you again on a lonely evening, maybe even putting you to sleep. I know a lot of times it takes me 2 or 3 nights to listen to an hour-long podcast episode, but that's okay. On tonight's show, I want to take a ride on the coattails of time and fly over the vast map of jazz history and take a look at its origins. Where and how did jazz music begin? Who were the musicians that pioneered this music? Finally, I want to offer a little help to those who may be new to jazz. You may wonder what jazz albums would be helpful in acquainting you with this early form of jazz music that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'll offer you a brief list of some albums that I think are worth owning in your collection. So let's buckle in on this evening and take a musical journey. The origins of jazz. Let's talk about that for just a moment. Let's talk about the word jazz. This is controversial. Did it originate from the obscene slang term jizz? Or from the slang term meaning spirit, energy, and vigor? This is a question that will be debated until the end of time for sure. But what's more important is this incredible music that takes this title. And then we talk about a genre of music. I think that's worth exploring here for a moment. Why do we call jazz jazz? What is jazz? Can it be defined? One interesting thing about music is, we come up with these genre labels. For what reason? Well, it's so that when we tell somebody about one of our favorite bands or artists, we can say this sounds like, right? So we can say that this new Eric Alexander album is a jazz album. Straight ahead jazz album, maybe to be more specific. And the tree of jazz, so to speak, has grown much and sprouted in different directions. The tree has many leaves now. Louis Armstrong really didn't think Diz and Bird were playing jazz. It's kind of foreign to him. And maybe that's the case when we look at some of the new forms of jazz today. We feel like, that's not jazz. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. Let's take a look at the time before jazz. We call that time ragtime. Ragtime was born out of Texarkana, and pioneered by Scott Joplin, who is a pianist and composer. He composed around 40 ragtime pieces or so. He was born in Texas, and he would travel along the Mississippi River playing music in shady red light districts in Missouri and Sedalia and St. Louis, and would move up and down the river up to Chicago and later to New York. Well, what is ragtime? Well, we could say ragtime is a loose type of piano playing, which Joplin viewed, interestingly enough, as a form of classical music. The left hand plays a steady succession of alternating bass notes, while the right hand plays syncopated melodies in a ragged fashion, hence the name ragtime. Another interesting fact is ragtime was conceived before records were invented. Many compositions were recorded on piano rolls. You ever see those old Western movies where you have the piano with the big roll there playing the keys of the piano? They were called player pianos. These pianos were fitted with a device enabling it to be played automatically by means of rotating a perforated paper roll that had punches in them. The piano would mechanically play the notes indicated by these unique perforations and holes for each song. The player piano was worked by a player usually pumping 2 foot pedals back and forth at the bottom of the piano, and the piano would roll and spin through a mechanism that would mechanically press down the correct piano keys, making the piano mechanically play these songs. And of course, the faster you pump the pedals, the faster the tempo would be. These piano rolls played songs such as Joplin's favorite tune, The Entertainer. Remember that one? Countless nights, these player pianos filled the booze-infused air of many saloons and bar rooms indeed. Most jazz historians, however, say that ragtime really isn't jazz because it rarely includes improvisation, and indeed improvisation is considered to be a core element of jazz. Let's talk about the first jazz band, shall we? Many have considered New Orleans as the city giving birth to jazz. This might be a bit of a simplistic view. While certainly New Orleans can boast as being a hotbed of early jazz innovation with the likes of the famous cornetist Buddy Bolden, cornetist King Oliver and Louis Armstrong, trombonist Kid Ory, and a host of others, jazz music arose out of several locations along the Mississippi. Traveling musicians from Chicago to New Orleans developed the jazz style known as Dixieland, which again came to prominence in New Orleans due to the important geographical location of the city. New Orleans was a melting pot, a very important port city to the entire southern United States. The Creole and African American population indeed integrated the sounds of Africa with elements of the Caribbean and merged it into a new sound, jazz. Even church music, the blues, again ragtime, and percussive elements of African music made a rich musical stew. The drums pounding off a Congo square became a hotbed of musical ideas, and jazz bands arose playing for many events around the city, including funerals, political rallies, and general public entertainment. What about those traveling park battles, or what we refer to as cutting heads? Also very popular in the blues tradition. You go back and read about Robert Johnson, the great blues guitarist and singer, how he would roll into a town in Mississippi and see a guitar player playing on the street corner, and he'd have some people listening to him, and he would go sit down and open his case up and start playing on the other side of the street and call them home back to him, cut the head of the guy on the other side of the street. And jazz indeed has that same characteristic. You have the stories of legend of Buddy Bolden, or who we call King Bolden, who was born September 6, 1877. He would also call his flock home, pulling a crowd away from his competitor, John Robichaux, from blocks away. These bands often traveled by wagon around the city competing for fans. Bolden played the music he heard by ear, and he adapted it to his cornet. And really, Bolden is a great demonstration of the merging of these musical styles, creating a fusion of this ragtime, black gospel music, marching band music, and the blues. And it's said that Bolden can play his cornet so loud that it can be heard across half the city, with the notes coming out of his horn floating across the dense, humid air of a hot New Orleans evening. King Bolden thrilled his crowds, entertaining them with exciting new sound infused with the blues. Bolden's story has indeed become legend, with his musical career ending with his mysterious disappearance into a mental ward. Quite an unfortunate thing. Bolden has been described as a wild man, woman chaser, a partier, heavy drinker. He gradually began to have mental episodes, and in 1906, he started exhibiting unpredictable behavior, experiencing paranoia, severe headaches, was getting into fights. Several incidents occurred where neither Bolden's mother or sister felt safe around him, and he often stayed with them. This caused a problem, and around 1907, something terrible would happen. Buddy's cornet would be forever silenced, never to be heard again, and Buddy never really seen again. Buddy's mother had him committed to the Louisiana State Asylum in Jackson, where he would remain until his death in 1931. Unfortunately, there are no recordings made of the first King of Jazz, so we can only imagine what he sounded like, based on his contemporaries and immediate successors such as King Oliver or Bunk Johnson, who claimed they were directly influenced by him. So did Jelly Roll Morton. Of course, King Oliver and Bunk Johnson, both horn players. So there are several early musicians who we could talk about here all night that pioneered this New Orleans jazz music, this early form of jazz, but I will touch only on a few of them tonight. There are 5 names that I consider to be extremely important when it comes to this early period in jazz. They're King Oliver, Jelly Roll Morton, Sidney Bechet, Kid Ory, and Louis Armstrong. Although I could name many more again, these 5 will offer an insightful glimpse into the early years of jazz. Let's talk about King Oliver first. King Oliver, born on December 19, 1881 in Aben, Louisiana, located just west down the river of New Orleans, on the banks of the Mississippi. Oliver is important for many reasons. For one, he was a direct disciple of Bolden, playing the cornet, we can assume, in much of the same style. Second, he was a composer who composed some important jazz pieces that have been handed down from generation to generation, writing tunes such as Dipper Mouth Blues, for example. Finally, he was a mentor of one of the most popular and innovative trumpet players ever. That's Louis Armstrong. Oliver moved down the river, or you could say eastward, across to New Orleans in his youth. He first played the trombone, then changed to cornet. From 1908 to 1917, he played the cornet in different brass and dance bands. He was known to entertain clientele in the city's red light district of New Orleans, and of course this was known as Storyville. Very popular area for music and entertainment and some other things going on there. Oliver, however, would spend his time between the hot, humid city of New Orleans and the windy city of Chicago. As work in Storyville began to eventually dry up, Oliver moved up to Chicago around 1918. And here in Chicago is where we begin to see even a bit of an evolution in jazz, because Chicago jazz began to incorporate faster tempos, more varied rhythms. Oliver also traveled west, playing in San Francisco and Oakland before forming his Creole band in Chicago around 1921. This band was important for a couple of reasons. For one, the band personnel, which included his protege, Louis Armstrong, on second cornet, Baby Dodds on drums, Johnny Dodds on clarinet, and Lil Hardin, a pianist who would become Armstrong's wife. These are important figures in the spread of New Orleans jazz. Second, the recordings made by this group for Jeanette, OK, Paramount, and Columbia brought jazz to a larger audience where it spread quickly to other parts of the country. These acoustic recordings were challenging. It's interesting to read about record production when you go back to these early acoustic recordings. They were very challenging to do. The recording was made by playing into a single horn, which vibrated the needle and cut the sound waves onto a soft wax cylinder. And it was a feat to get an even recording, a balanced sound for each instrument. And this can only be done by room location. And a lot of times you had to move people around during the song. For example, it's said that Armstrong's cornet was so loud, he played so loud that he had to put him in the very back corner so he wouldn't overpower everyone else in the room. If you had a singer, that singer had to almost get their head in the horn, depending on who they were. And of course, they had to sing very loud. You had people like Bessie Smith, who had just powerful voices back then. They could stand off of a stage with no amplification. Ma Rainey the same way. These blues singers could belt it out. They would also experiment. I mean, recording engineers tried everything under the sun to get these acoustic recordings to sound decent. They had sometimes platforms built. They would put chairs up on top of a platform, and there were often comical things that would happen. People would fall during the middle of a song. So this was quite a challenging thing to make these recordings. Nonetheless, these recordings are of historical importance for us lovers of jazz music. In the mid-1920s, Oliver enlarged his band to include 9 musicians performing under the name King Oliver and his Dixie Syncopators. He began using written arrangements with jazz solos marked in his arrangements. So he kind of started to create the solo, if you will, because jazz at that time consisted of multiple people improvising at the same time usually. And eventually Oliver's band performing at the Plantation Cafe would be in competition with his student, now Louis Armstrong, had formed his own band called the Sunset Stompers, who performed at the Sunset Cafe. This would be a friendly rivalry. This was inspired by Lil Hardin, who told Armstrong, "You need to go out and do your own thing." And indeed he did. Oliver would venture off to New York briefly, but unfortunately he had dental problems, which made playing his trumpet very difficult for him. And in 1937, he had to quit playing music altogether. The king died at an early age, at 56, on April 10th, 1938, in Savannah, Georgia. But of course, the story doesn't end there, because we get to Louis Armstrong, who was born in New Orleans in 1901. We know him as Pops or Satchmo. He's one of the most important and best-known figures of this early period of jazz, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that his importance can't be overstated. He is so important that really an entire episode should be dedicated to his memory. We can probably do several episodes, but for now, we'll just touch on his life and some important musical achievements. Armstrong is also personally important for me because he was my introduction to jazz. He was the gateway to jazz for me. The first record I ever purchased was a CD of Louis Armstrong Plays W.C. Handy, which is still one of my favorite records. I have several copies of it. The complete recordings on CD. I've got 4 different copies, I think, on vinyl, and it is just one of my favorites. I do recommend that you have this in your collection if you want to hear some of the best of what that early jazz sounds like. At first glance, one may think that Armstrong's merely going to continue on the legacy of his mentor, King Oliver. And indeed, he does pick up the torch, but this is a gross understatement because there are a host of reasons why he's even more important in our jazz listening vocabulary. First, Armstrong could be said to be the pioneer of jazz improvisation, taking what his predecessors gave him and vastly expanding upon it. He was really the first jazz musician on record to really expand upon this, what we call a jazz solo, making it stand out as a personal statement beyond what was called for in these compositions that were written. Second, his singing. He's one of the first to scat. Very unique voice. And, not that many people can scat well. There are a lot of scatters these days, and there aren't very many good ones. Armstrong had that knack of being able to ad-lib and come up with these nonsensical phrases and put them to music. He is really the first person to add vocals, any significant amount of vocals, to jazz music. He paved the way for singers to integrate blues into the jazz language. And finally, Armstrong's career is expansive. It spans a course of over 50 years, which means he collaborated with many of its stars throughout these years. Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, many others, and even those beboppers he eventually got along with. But Lewis begins his musical journey on the streets of New Orleans, spending his younger days in extreme poverty, living off of Rampart Street originally in a neighborhood known as the Battlefield. Lewis's family, including himself, at times worked for a Jewish family called the Karnowskis. And Morris Karnowski famously gave Armstrong an advance toward purchasing a cornet from a pawn shop, for which Lewis was forever grateful. When Armstrong was 11, he dropped out of school, singing and playing on the streets for tips. As a teenager, he bounced between houses of his parents and step-parents, never feeling at home, often living, again, in extreme poverty. Finding himself in trouble at times playing in dance halls, having disputes with men and women of ill repute, one of which he was stabbed by a prostitute, young Lewis got a paying job quickly with Fate Maribel, playing in his brass band going up and down the Mississippi on riverboats. Maribel, a capable pianist, a good musician, a well-versed musician who taught his band how to read music. He took Armstrong under his wing. Musicians had a saying around New Orleans. When a musician would get a job on the riverboats with Fate Maribel, they would say, "Well, you're going to the conservatory." The conservatory, sorry. Say, you're going to the conservatory. You're going to learn something. And indeed, Lewis did learn something. He learned a lot about performing, but he also learned how to read music. 1922, Armstrong moved to Chicago at the invitation of King Oliver. He would travel back and forth between the Windy City and the Big Easy for many years. And Oliver's band, again, was one of Chicago's most popular and influential jazz bands in the early 20s. Armstrong was paid well, and he must have thought he was living a luxurious lifestyle. He actually had his own apartment with his own private bathroom. Now, we might think about that and say, big deal, For him, that was a big deal because he was very poor. Used to not having anything, had to share everything. Having his own apartment, his own bathroom was a big deal. His reputation grew as one of the best cornet players around, even surpassing that of his mentor. It was said that Armstrong could blow 200 high C's in a row and he would practice endlessly, and his solos sounded like no one else. As his reputation grew, Armstrong was often challenged to cutting contests by other musicians, again, where musicians would challenge each other and play back and forth trying to outplay one another. Armstrong's first studio recordings were with Oliver for Jeanette Records, and a whole episode could be done on Jeanette Records, a very important record label. But they made their first recording on April 5th and 6th, 1922. Jeanette Records was a small recording outfit spawned from a piano manufacturer called Star Piano Company out of Richmond, Indiana. The studio was primitive, and it kind of makes me laugh when I think about all the technology we have now and how we can record in our own home studio with pretty good equipment. Even prosumer equipment sounds pretty good. But we go back to this primitive studio that was built out of a wooden railroad warehouse sitting on the side of the railroad tracks, insulated with only linens. It had sheets hanging from the walls and padding. And often they had to stop recording as trains passed by, shaking the whole building. Armstrong and Oliver did eventually part amicably in 1924, again at the instigation of Lil Hardin, who really wanted Lewis to go out and do his own thing. Shortly afterward, Armstrong was invited to go to New York City and play with the big outfit, the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra. Little tongue twister there. The top American band at the time for jazz. They were a big deal. He switched to the trumpet here. This is important because this is where he goes from cornet to trumpet in order to blend in better and even stand out a little more with the other musicians in the band. Armstrong's influence on Henderson's tenor saxophone player is important because it was Coleman Hawkins. During this time, Armstrong recorded with Clarence Williams as well, a friend that he had from New Orleans. He recorded with the Williams Blues Five, recorded with Sidney Bechet, who we'll talk about here, and even blues singers Alberta Hunter, Ma Rainey, and Bessie Smith. 1925, Armstrong, he goes back to Chicago, largely again at the insistence of his wife, Lil Armstrong. In publicity, much to his chagrin, she billed him as, quote-unquote, the world's greatest trumpet player. For a time, he was a member of even the Lil Hardin Armstrong band. He worked with his wife. But more importantly, Armstrong formed his Louis Armstrong and Hot Five. Important recordings, indeed. Recorded hits such as Potato Head Blues and Muggles. Muggles being a slang term for marijuana. But the Hot Five was an important band. You had Kid Ory on the trombone, Johnny Dodds on clarinet, Johnny St. Cyr on the banjo, Lil Hardin on piano. Usually there was no drummer. Over a 12-month period starting in 1925, this quintet produced 24 records that are recognized by all jazz historians as indeed a turning point in jazz. Among the Hot Fives and Hot Seven records, you had Cornet Chop Suey, Strutting with Some Barbecue, Hotter Than That, Potato Head Blues again, which all featured unique and highly creative solos by Armstrong. Soon after, he recorded with pianist Earl Father Hines, I should say. The famous 1928 Weatherbird duet showcased Lewis's trumpet introduction and solo in West End Blues, which remain some of the most important improvisations in early jazz history. Young trumpet players across the country were enamored with Lewis. They wanted to sound like him. They bought the recordings. They memorized his solos and tried to imitate him. Armstrong indeed forever changed the meaning of jazz solo, basically creating it. And even though Oliver had kind of started on that avenue, he didn't get a chance to really develop it, and Armstrong indeed did. Another important development, again, was the addition of the scat singing. This is, of course, improvised vocal jazz using nonsensical words. And he was among the first to record it on the Hot Five recording known as Heebie Jeebies in 1926. This recording was so popular, the group was the most famous jazz band in the country after this record came out. First half of 1927 is when he assembled his Hot Seven group, which added the drummer Al Baby Dodds and tuba player Pete Briggs. John Thomas eventually replaced Kid Ory on the trombone. And later that year, Armstrong organized a series of new Hot Five sessions, which resulted in 9 more records. Again, these records are very important. So if you don't have those, I would suggest getting the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens. You can find those usually in a set of CDs, or you can get some of them on vinyl. Those are very important records if you're interested in jazz history and interested on how things kind of got started. As time went on, though, Lewis developed both his trumpet tone and vocals to suit more elaborate stage shows. Armstrong found himself in New York playing at Connie's Inn in Harlem, which was a chief rival to the Cotton Club, which was kind of dangerous because that Cotton Club was owned by gangster Dutch Schultz, who then they had a lot of elaborate floor shows. you ever seen the movie Cotton Club? It's well worth watching. I'm not sure how exactly how accurate it is, but it is entertaining. Armstrong also had considerable success with vocal recordings, including definitive versions of tunes composed by his friend, pianist Hoagy Carmichael. Armstrong lived through the evolution of recording technology. This is also very important because when you move from acoustic recordings to electric recordings, everything changes when it comes to the vocalist. So 1930s were remarkable because of the improvement in sound compared to the earlier recordings that they had. He now sang through the new and now legendary RCA ribbon microphone, which was introduced in 1931. Important, because now the vocalist didn't have to yell. Just as I'm sitting here now talking into this microphone and you can hear me very clearly, well, that's a big game changer. You didn't have to have someone like Ma Rainey belting it out where you could hear her across, 4 blocks. The vocalist no longer had to yell into the horn. Now they could use their voice in a new way. They can use dynamics. This is where the whole crooning came from. You got those new breed of singers, the Bing Crosby, Nat King Cole, soon Frank Sinatra. These crooners would sing completely different than the old blues singers of old. And having those dynamics really changes things. You can bring your voice down. You can pull yourself back away from the microphone and then come back in close. All kinds of cool things you can do. Armstrong's success continued, and his interpretation of Hoagy Carmichael's Stardust became one of the most successful versions of this song ever recorded. And it showcased this new vocal sound. As I said earlier, I could dedicate episodes to Lewis. In order to get in my other 3 musicians, though, it will suffice to say that Armstrong's career took off and continued until he died in 1971 at the age of 69. He was one of the most recorded and financially successful jazz musicians of the time. He indeed became an icon, a jazz ambassador, a man whose hit Hello Dolly knocked the Beatles from number 1 position on the charts in 1964. And really, that was the death knell for jazz when it came to radio. That was pretty much it, if you want to call that song jazz. But indeed, an important time there, the 60s, which we'll get to in another episode. He recorded hundreds of records and appeared on many television appearances and even on the silver screen, bringing jazz music to the forefront of American entertainment and beyond. More importantly, he changed the landscape of jazz by introducing what we now understand as the jazz solo. Again, leave your comments, folks. I hope you're enjoying this. I'm a big history guy, so I love learning about this. I hope you guys get something out of this. Another one of the early jazz innovators we have to talk about is pianist Jelly Roll Morton, whose birth name was Ferdinand Joseph Lamoth, who once controversially claimed, "I am the inventor of jazz music," he once said. A very interesting character. He was born into a Creole community in New Orleans around 1890. But his importance to the development of jazz piano playing, again, I think can't be overstated, because he, along with pianist James P. Johnson, they both contributed greatly to the transformation of ragtime piano into jazz piano. Morton started out playing at a young age, maybe around the age of 13 or 14. I guess not so young as maybe some others have that we know about, but he began playing piano in a brothel. Started using the name Jelly Roll. And this is the original Jelly Roll, not this other guy going around calling himself Jelly Roll. Sorry. While working there, he was living with his devout church-going grandmother, who would have just completely blew her stack if she knew he was working at a place like this. He convinced her that he was working as a night watchman in a barrel factory. Eventually, Morton's grandmother did discover he was playing jazz in a brothel and hit the roof. Disowned him for disgracing the family name, and he was out on his own. Around 1904, Morton started touring in the U.S. South, working in minstrel shows with acts such as Will Benbow's Chocolate Drops. Regular activities including, of course, all the stuff that goes on, gambling, drinking, partying. He started composing his own songs, many of which became early standards, such as Jelly Roll Blues, New Orleans Blues, and King Porter Stomp, later recorded by Benny Goodman and many others. In 1915, Jelly Roll Blues was one of the first jazz compositions to be published. In 1912-14, Morton toured with his girlfriend Rosa Brown as a vaudeville act before they moved to Chicago for a few years. But as we can see, jazz music was already being played in several cities up and down the Mississippi, even as far north as Canada. Morton was invited to perform at the Hotel Patricia nightclub in Vancouver, Canada. Author Mark Miller described his arrival as an extended period of itinerancy as a pianist, vaudeville performer, and other things such as gambler, hustler, and as legend would have it, a pimp. Morton returned to Chicago in 1923 to release his first of his commercial recordings, first as Piano Rules, then on record, both as a piano soloist and with jazz bands. In 1926, Morton signed a recording contract with the Victor Talking Machine Company, giving him the opportunity to record with a well-rehearsed band playing his own arrangements in the Victor Recording Studios of Chicago. These now famous and influential recordings are by Jelly Roll Morton and his Red Hot Peppers. Band members included trombonist Kid Ory, Omar Simeon, George Mitchell, Johnny St. Cyr, Johnny Dodds, Baby Dodds. Familiar names. No, these musicians will often cross-pollinate with different musicians, playing with one another in different bands. These recordings indeed represent another milestone for jazz music. While Armstrong was developing the jazz solo on his cornet, Morton was developing a new style of jazz piano playing. Morton often played the melody of a tune with his right thumb while playing a harmony above the melodic notes with the right hand. He favored playing a diminished fifth above the melody, giving him a unique sound. Morton also walked in major and minor sixths on the bass notes instead of tenths or octaves. This method was a modified style that was popular in New Orleans. Morton is important for creating his own style of jazz on piano, and he once said, "All my fellow musicians are much faster players, much faster in manipulations, I thought, than I, and I did not feel as though I was in their class, but instead used a slower tempo to integrate more notes not commonly used." After Morton moved to New York City, he continued to record for Victor, but his recordings weren't selling well. That kind of sounds familiar, right? Jazz makes up less than 4% of all record sales now. But due to the Great Depression and poor record sales, RCA Victor did not renew his recording contract for 1931. He continued playing in New York but struggled financially. Even though his song King Porter Stomp became a hit in 1935, Morton received no royalties from it. Sounds familiar again. The old record companies. 1935, Morton moved to Washington, D.C., to become a manager and piano player at a bar called by multiple names at various times: the Music Box, Blue Moon Inn, or the Jungle Inn. During Morton's brief residency at the Music Box, the folklorist, archivist Alan Lomax heard him play, and in May 1938, Lomax invited Morton to record music and interviews for the Library of Congress. Lomax was interested in those old Storyville days in New Orleans, and although at first reluctant to record, Morton agreed to record for Lomax. Probably needed the cash, right? The suggestive nature of these songs, though, prevented the recordings from being released until 2005. We can hear that rain coming down tonight. Bet you can hear it there. In 1938, Morton was stabbed in the head and chest by a friend of the Music Box's club owner. This was tragic. Morton really never recovered. First of all, the closest hospital, a whites-only hospital, refused to treat him. Result, he had to be transported to a black hospital further away. But he didn't receive good care there. Doctors putting his wounds on ice for several hours before even looking at the injury. As a result, he never fully recovered. He was often ill, short of breath. Asthma attacks sent him to the hospital in New York for several months. He continued to suffer from respiratory problems. Morton tried to go to Los Angeles. He moved out there trying to revive his career, but unfortunately he died on July 10th, 1941. He had a week and a half stay in the Los Angeles County General Hospital. He was believed to be 50 years old. Tragic end. And we have a lot of those in jazz, don't we? We have the drug overdoses. We have the people getting shot. We have, different tragic endings, car crashes, and other unfortunate ends for these musicians. Let's move on to our trombonist, important trombonist, Kid Ory. And if you want to get a great record, get Kid Ory Plays W.C. Handy. That's another great record. Kid Ory, birth name Edward Ory, was born not too far from where King Oliver's birthplace was, west of New Orleans off the Mississippi River in a little town called Laplace. Ory was born in 1886 to a Louisiana French-speaking family of black Creole descent on Woodland Plantation. Ory, in his early years, he traveled up and down the river to New Orleans, even as a teenager, where he became acquainted with many musicians and even was very popular. He had a lot of family obligations, though, so he couldn't move to New Orleans until he was 21 years old. And he started his career as a composer and tailgate trombone player. In his earlier years, however, Ory played the banjo at fish fries and other gatherings, and this, they say, influenced his rhythmic style of trombone playing. This is going to be very important. Ory said this about his early years. He says, "My first instrument was a banjo, which I made myself out of a cigar box. When I got to age 10, my father bought me a proper New Orleans banjo. At 13, I put together a band in the place I was living at then, Laplace, Louisiana, about 32 miles from New Orleans. We had a homemade violin, a homemade bass, homemade guitar and banjo, and a chair as a drum kit. We put aside all the money we could to buy better instruments as we went along. We went wherever there were lots of people, and we worked hard. Our takings were mounting, and I decided to organize picnics, providing beer and salad. Admission 15 cents, including dancing." Ory was a great businessman. He started renting out halls and made quite a bit of money and did well for himself. When Ory was living on Jackson Avenue, he claimed he was discovered by Buddy Bolden while playing his first new trombone, which is a little bit different than the old Civil War trombones. Ory had one of the best bands in New Orleans, all the way back to the 1910s when he was really young. He hired many of the great musicians of the city, who we've already heard about, including King Oliver and Louis Armstrong, who joined the band in 1919. So these guys all played in each other's bands. He also played with clarinetist Johnny Dodds and Jimmy Noon. As we can see, these musicians did not develop the jazz language alone. They did it together. Ory proved to be, again, a creative businessman, and he took what had been an advertising medium for social events as a horse-drawn wagon full of musicians and turned it into a way to promote his band. At first, he simply put the name of his band and his telephone number on the side of the wagon, and he got some business that way for sure. As a trombonist, though, Ory had to sit in the back of the wagon on the truck. He had to aim that big slide out over the tailgate, away from the other members of the band, and he developed a new style of trombone playing called tailgate. And this was quite different. The trombone in a New Orleans marching band played the bass line and laid down the beat. Ory realized that sitting in the tailgate instead of marching offered a new way of playing. Instead of a simple bass line, he started playing fills between these melodic phrases of the other instruments. Or he developed a unique rural approach to his phrasing and technique, which freed him from the bass line, freed him from keeping a strict beat, instead indulging in the same rhythmic variations that the jazz trumpet and clarinet players played. Kid also used a slurring technique that was sometimes frowned upon by players called the glissando. And although the use of the glissando was used frequently in minstrel shows, Ori helped define this type of role in jazz. He defined and emphasized the harmonic structure of a piece with these slurs. This type of playing, again, became known as the tailgate style of playing. 1919, Ori moved to Los Angeles, as many of the New Orleans musicians did at the time, recording there in 1922. In 1925, Ori moved to Chicago, where he was very active. He worked and recorded with Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Oliver, Johnny Dodds, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and others. Again, we see how jazz developed in multiple places at nearly the same time. Ori mentored Benny Goodman, and later, Charles Mingus. As we learned earlier, Ori was a member of the original lineup of Louis Armstrong's Hot 5, which first recorded November 12, 1925. His composition, Muskrat Ramble, was included in the Hot 5 session of February 26 and became a favorite tune to be covered by jazz musicians. And you'll see that tune all over those early jazz records. During the Great Depression, which spanned a decade between 1929 and 1939, Ori retired from music and did not play again until 1943. Again, he ran a chicken farm in Los Angeles. Having been a friend of Jelly Roll Morton in 1941, he was his pallbearer, one of his pallbearers at Morton's funeral in L.A. His career was revived after about a decade of being out of the public eye. From 1944 to 1961, he led one of the top New Orleans-style bands of the period. And the Ori Band was indeed a driving force in reviving interest in New Orleans jazz. He appeared on popular 1940s radio broadcasts, among them spots on the Orson Welles show. During the 1940s and early 50s, he often appeared at the Beverly Cavern in Los Angeles. In 1958, he purchased a nightclub called the Tin Angel in San Francisco and renamed it On the Levee. Ori did retire for good in 1966. He spent the rest of his life in Hawaii, eventually getting pneumonia, and he died of a heart attack in Honolulu. Last on our list, we need to take a look at Sidney Bechet, a multi-instrumentalist. Born in New Orleans in 1897, he, along with Armstrong, became instrumental in changing the way jazz musicians played solos. Bechet was born into a middle-class Creole family. His father, Omar, was a shoemaker and a flute player, and all four of his brothers were musicians. Bechet learned and mastered several instruments that were kept around the house, including the cornet. He was for the most part self-taught, but he decided to specialize in playing the clarinet, which he played almost exclusively until about 1919. Later in his youth, Bechet studied with King Oliver, Bunk Johnson, Freddie Keppard, and others in several ensembles around the city. While working with Louis Armstrong, Bechet was one of the first musicians to develop the swing style of jazz. Again, bringing that ragtime feel into jazz, but developing it. In the spring of 1919, he went to New York City and played with Will Marion Cook's Syncopated Orchestra, traveled overseas to Europe, where he performed with the Royal Philharmonic Hall in London. Bechet gained a lot of recognition there as time went by. And Bechet was unique because he was a multi-instrumentalist. But not just a multi-instrumentalist where a lot of people that play more than one instrument will often play it kind of the same way, with the same style or same phrasing. Well, he was quite different. He played each instrument from a completely different angle, if you will. While in London, he discovered the soprano saxophone. and he developed playing this. It was very distinct from his clarinet playing. We could say that Bechet was probably the first guy to make the soprano saxophone accepted as a jazz instrument. Bechet's first recordings were made in 1923 and 24. In 1924, he worked with Duke Ellington for 3 months. It was a significant influence on Ellington, they say. Duke Ellington referred to Bechet as the epitome of jazz. Bechet, over the Atlantic to France, also became popular. He found out that he was appreciated much more over there than the United States. Of course, a lot of jazz musicians would find that out. While in France, Bechet got into trouble with the law, though, and found himself sitting in a jail cell in Paris for 11 long months. He accidentally shot a woman. He was actually trying to gun down another musician who insulted him on the bandstand, accusing him of playing a wrong note. That's pretty serious business there. They say there are no friends on the bandstand, right? He had challenged the man to a duel. He was so mad. He says, Sidney Bechet never plays the wrong note. After a stay in jail, Bechet was deported to New York, stepping off the boat soon after the stock market crash of 1929. While in New York, Bechet led and played with several bands, befriending trumpet player Roy Eldridge, another important musician. In 1939, Bechet and the pianist Willie the Lion Smith led a group that recorded several early versions of what was later called Latin jazz. They adapted traditional merengue, rumba, and Haitian songs into the jazz language. On July 28, 1940, Bechet made an appearance on the NBC radio show The Chamber Music Society of Lower Basin Street. He played 2 of his showpieces, Shake It and Break It and St. Louis Blues, with Henry Levine's Dixieland Band. Bechet later joined Levin in the RCA Victor recording studio, which was located on 24th Street in New York City. Bechet played his soprano sax on Levin's arrangement of Muskrat Ramble. While Bechet's unique style of play spanned across several instruments, he also made history on April 18, 1941. He participated in one of the early recording experiments at Victor Studios. Very interesting, because he was one of the first that tried overdubbing, playing several instruments and overdubbing. So he played the Sheik of Araby with 6 different instruments. He played the clarinet, soprano saxophone, tenor saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. But unfortunately, all this success was doing little for his pocketbook. And by the end of the 1940s, Bechet grew tired of struggling to make it in the music business in the United States. He was unable to play outside the country because of his recording contract, so he didn't re-up. He found success in France, moving there permanently in 1951 after his notable performance as a soloist at the Paris Jazz Fair. This performance caused a huge rise in his popularity, where he now was able to make a decent living playing music. In 1953, he signed a recording contract with the French label Disque Vogue that lasted for the rest of his life. Bechet died near Paris of lung cancer on May 14th of 1959 on his 62nd birthday. But his musical influence has certainly left a lasting legacy on jazz players all the way to today. He even has a park named for him in Antibes, France, and his music has now been used on the soundtracks of about 60 films. I wonder who owns that catalog. In closing, first of all, I thank you for hanging out with me on this show. Again, leave your comments. And I don't know how many of these I'll do. It'll be all, this takes a lot of time to put this together. But I really enjoy doing it. And I hope that you guys enjoy listening. It's interesting to see how the lives of all these early jazz musicians intersected over these years, and how each of them on their instruments forever changed the way music was played. And they essentially created the foundation of the jazz language. While there are certainly many others we could talk about tonight, these 5, I think, offer a rich cross-section of important jazz recordings that all jazz fans should investigate. If you go through and you really investigate the output of these 5 musicians, you're also going to familiarize yourself with an abundance of other jazz musicians that were important, because they all played with one another at one time or another. As far as the discography goes, I would say this list here is a good place to start. First of all, you need to have Louis Armstrong's Hot 5s and Hot 7s. Louis Armstrong plays W.C. Handy, wonderful recording, great vocals. Louis Armstrong plays King Oliver, wonderful record. Kid Ory plays W.C. Handy, another one of my favorites. Kid Ory, the legendary Kid. Sidney Bechet, I think the Grandmaster of Soprano Saxophone and Clarinet is a great album to pick up. When it comes to Jelly Roll Morton, get the Jelly Roll Morton and his Red Hot Peppers that you'll find on the Victor label. These are all fantastic, and the interesting thing about these musicians, you can find their records very inexpensive. Nobody likes to collect Dixieland jazz, or what I just like to call early jazz. You know, Dixieland's kind of a, not a very accurate description, I think, of all the early jazz, because, again, it changes. When you go up to Chicago, it's a little bit different. To New York, it's a little bit different. You go out to the West Coast, a little bit different. Kansas City, a little bit different. They all have their own things going on. But this, I think, is a good discography to start with. And, again, it's very inexpensive if you're a record collector to go and collect a lot of this early jazz, because jazz collectors are interested only in the Blue Notes, the Riverside records, all these reissues of these hard bop, post bop, and some of the bebop stuff. But when you go to this early jazz, it doesn't get enough recognition, that's for sure, because without these guys, you have no Charlie Parker, you have no Diz. I appreciate you joining me on my first episode of Jazz Themes. Leave your comments. I'm signing off. I'm Matthew Bellisario. Have a good evening, and happy listening to you.